or for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by Interim Regional Director at Oxfam, Horn, East and Central Africa, Parvin Ngala. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the issue, maybe let's start with a definition of what extreme hunger is. What will be happening?
Thank you very much. Yes, at the moment, over 21 million people across Kenya, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia are already in what we call food security classification, IPC3 or above. This means, that there is an acute food security and livelihood crisis. And at the moment, there's a severe level of hunger amidst conflict, flooding, and the worst drought in the last 2 years, indeed over 40 years, over the last 40 years.
All right, so now the region that we're talking about has had its own issues in terms of conflicts. But now there's another conflict in the equation, but it's all the way up in Eastern Europe. And I just wonder if we are feeling the effects and that this potentially could exacerbate things for us in our region in the East and the Horn of Africa.
Yes, it is unfortunate that the escalating Ukraine crisis is dealing a very big blow to the East Africa hunger crisis. We note that at the moment, in terms of East Africa, we import 90% of the wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And when we look at the prices of food, and especially grains and oil, they've been rising exponentially. And unfortunately, it's the poorest and the most vulnerable that are at the center of this. One of the things we are looking at in our report is that we're noting that people have really been stretched to their limit. Many of them are having to skip meals to feed their children. They're selling off their assets, and some are having to marry off their young daughters to be able to pay for food and medicine.
So what's the call from Oxfam, and who is it to?
I think the call is very much to both the international community but also the local governments. On the immediate part, what we do have in terms of an appeal on resources is for funding for the UN humanitarian appeal for the East Africa hunger crisis, which is at $6 billion US. And at the moment, only 3% of it has been funded. So that is a big priority for us. The other thing, of course, is for an end to conflict. Now, prioritizing human lives over political gains. And of course, just by virtue of the fact of what we've highlighted in terms of the impact on the food supply chain, that we need to look at suitable alternatives. So those are some of the immediate priorities that we would call out. But I would like to also add that on the longer term, and some of these were the submissions at the COP 26 last year, where we highlighted the fact that we need to cut, especially the global north, we need to cut carbon emissions, we need to repay those countries who are facing the highest impact of climate change in terms of loss and damage, and also to be able to help them adapt to the impact of climate change. I would also add that we call for cancellation of debts because many of our governments are struggling with the resources needed to both support the communities who are facing economic impacts, but also have the social protection mechanisms that support them in dealing with these climatic shocks.
All right, so climatic shocks, that brings me to the next question that I did have for you, and that is, sadly, these droughts are no longer things that happen occasionally. It's almost a norm now. So what needs to change in terms of adapting to these climatic shocks? Yes, reducing carbon emissions, but we need to do things urgently now.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we've been learning as an organization and with our partners is the importance of early action. In 2010, we had a failure really of the communities and international community in terms of responding to what was then a very big drought. And at that time, 260,000 people died because of hunger and starvation. We did learn from that crisis in 2010, in 2017, where we then responded with early action and early response. We are hoping that this time, unfortunately, as we see protracted crises, recurring droughts, that we really act now and respond in a similar way to what we did in 2017 to help avert catastrophe.
All right, so food prices are going up in various parts of the world depending on where one connects to this Ukraine crisis. Is this what we're seeing in the region as well?
Yes. For example, last week I was in Somalia, and because they are very reliant on the grain imported from Ukraine and Russia, already the prices have doubled. Fuel in many parts of the region also has increased substantially in terms of costs, and that has an escalating impact on other elements of whether it is the food, whether it is other different forms of supply. So very much we are feeling the impact in this region.
All right, so 21 plus million people now. If things don't get better, how bad could it get?
It could get worse, especially because what we are seeing in terms of predictions on the May rainy season is that it is going to be below average. And that being the case, it means at the moment we are anticipating over 28 million people moving to extreme levels of hunger. And in that case, we are still calling on the communities, on the international community, on donors to provide and support communities, in this case, in terms of funding, very much input into the $6 billion US dollar appeal that we have put out with the UN.
All right, your report talks about a massive no regrets mobilization of international humanitarian aid. What does that mean?
No regrets for us is especially the need to have early action. Like we said, the climate crisis very much, unfortunately, is being felt in countries that have had very little in terms of contribution to that crisis. Many of the communities are facing year in, year out, droughts, locust infestation, and in that sense, then we have to say early action. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that in 2011 we had over 250,000 people dying from hunger and starvation means we need to act now and prevent a full-blown catastrophe.
There's some quite telling stories in your report, and I'm moved by one of them, a Sudanese woman, Nyandang, who says that in all 40 years of her life, she's never seen anything like what she's seeing now. And that's how severe the combination of climatic shocks plus everything else is. And so I guess we need to pay more attention to the region and act quicker.
Absolutely. I think when we look at it in terms of the impact, the people who are affected, whether it is children, we've been saying children crying in Ukraine, the sound of children crying in East Africa is the same. And prioritizing, especially in this case, climatic shocks. The example you share in Sudan, the food crisis is driven by floods. And what we see is that there's extreme weather events that are driving this different food security crisis in the region. And indeed, the need for us to be able to cast a spotlight on action, whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is in Afghanistan, whether it is in Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, that really across the globe we do need to support those who are facing crisis.
I mean, the woes just seem to pile on, and some might even say they're of biblical proportions when one considers that there's even, locust swarms that have come at a level haven't been seen for decades.
Yes. Over the last 2 years, we've been calling it within Oxfam the triple C's, conflict, climate, and COVID, climate, and my apologies. Yeah. And all these crises really are building up. And when we look at climate change in terms of the locust infestations, that's just one of the manifestations.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for bringing the story to our attention, and let's hope that people listen and act urgently, because a crisis is developing and getting deeper every single day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's Parvin Ngala speaking to us about this report by Oxfam. She's the Interim Regional Director, Oxfam Horn, East and Central Africa.